Welcome to Let's Talk Valuechain, a podcast where we explore the different activities, trends, topics, and components within value chains from manufacturing to impacts on supply chains to AI to blockchains.
This episode is going to be unique because we're welcoming Adam, who's a co-founder of Assemble You and a host of L&D Challenge, his podcast, to actually ask me questions about why we are doing Let's Talk Value Chain and what does that mean and the different aspects towards that. So, Adam, over to you.
Great to be here, Nish. Thanks for inviting me on as a, yes, not as a guest, but as a guest host. It's brilliant to be here. Well, my first question is a relatively simple one. I think is a great place to start, which is what does value chain mean? So kick us off.
Yeah, so that's very interesting, right? I mean, I've heard the term and only came across the term a couple of years ago, but value chain is every aspect and system in your business that is creating, some input to your products, services, and to the customer. So it links everything down from different multi-tiers of your supply chain to your internal manufacturing to all the way to your products going to your customers and that customer engagement happening. So for any business, a value chain has multiple streams and multiple touch points today. And as we know from our own experiences that getting a good fit with a customer, adding value is not a one-stop shop. There's multiple layers that you have to get right. And that's what a value chain for us is making sure that end-to-end aspect of the journey in manufacturing, in other sectors, what the stakeholders think it means and how is the value creation happening towards that.
Yeah, I like it because it's not just looking at, something happens and something else happens and something else happens. Value chain encompasses all the pieces of the puzzle, if you like. Anything that touches a process that adds value can be included in that chain. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Great. Cool. So let's talk about the podcast a bit. What is the purpose behind the podcast and who's it aimed at? Who should be listening to this?
So yeah, again, I pondered about this with the team as well. And I think the key thing we're looking at is we as a company are called Value Chain, right? And in multiple conferences and events that I go into, they'll talk about something and refer value chain as a term. So that was quite interesting for me because coming into this domain, understanding that terminology is used across sectors. It's a common terminology that's utilized. And that gave me to thinking, okay, we understand manufacturing. That's what we do, aerospace. What about the stakeholders in that industry? How do they interpret the value chain? How does somebody in a food sector understand value chain? How does somebody in the space sector, which is currently evolving, understand value chain? So the key aspect is speak to different stakeholders, people working across sectors, understand where the value chains mean for them, where the focus area is to be able to create that impact. And for the listeners from different aspects, if they, coming into industry today, still in school, or already in specific industry, for them to learn and understand that there's so many different aspects that, important to for every business in different sectors. And there's commonalities across all of them as well. And I think that's what we want to explore and share that knowledge together because actual innovation happens through cross collaboration and understanding. And sometimes you might be hearing something about agri-tech and food industry, and you might apply that into learning and skills development, right? Which you would have not thought of. And I think that's something that we really want to make an impact with is, get our guests and understand and talk about these topics.
Brilliant. So industry agnostic.
Yeah.
Across any industry. And is there a focus? Is it going to be focused on manufacturing? Are you looking at value chains of service businesses as well, or?
Yeah, so we are speaking to companies that were within our network that we know who have agreed to come on board. These are not necessarily customers, but partners, collaborators, or somebody who's interested to talk about their industry, right? So, for example, for one of our first episodes, we had Professor Jaybal, who's a researcher on supply chain, now retired, and actually still looking at how does generative AI impact supply chains right now and how is it going to change the landscape across skilling, how we consume the data and even predictions that happen today, right? So that's, I think, something that we are looking at. So we are bringing on people who are willing to talk about their industries and their value propositions. And we are quite keen to take that journey out in that first season for ourselves and learn from that and share that learning.
Great. And who are some of the other guests? Don't mind me asking.
Yeah, so the official list, it's a dynamic one right now. We're still building. So we've had, obviously, as I said, Professor Jaybal, who's already been on. We've had people like Rich Dale, who runs MRP company, which is supporting SME digitization with their data. We're speaking to people who are from innovation expertise, people who come from expertise on hydrogen supply chains as well. Also people who are part of, government, looking at, where are the investment needs to be going in? What are the programs that looks to do it? So it's a very, very list. And I'm sure by the time that we air this, we would have a full list of people who will be coming on here.
Cool. And why are value chains are value chains more important now than ever? What's the why behind all this?
So if you think about the global events that have been happening I would say the pandemic as a big one where it's all kicked off from, but even prior to that, there are global events happening that impact everything from, localized governments to supply chains to industries and so on. And we've seen those massive disruptions happen, and tech becoming an enabler to understand and, work around that. And, even for the last few years after the pandemic, the Ukraine war happening, the Red Sea crisis happening, the Suez Canal crisis happening, right now we have got the Baltimore accident that happened as well. These are all different world events that happen. And while we can't control those world events, having a clear understanding of what my customers' value chain impacts look like is critical. Because if you don't know what your weak points are, how are you going to go and resolve them, right? And you don't have to start from scratch. There might be things in aerospace industry, in food sector, or in any other industry that they might already be doing, which you could adapt. And I think it's becoming critical because when these value chains get broken, there's loss of jobs, loss of opportunities, and loss in the economy that's happening. And in the current world where tech is enabling so much opportunity and we can have so much data, we should not be falling prey to the fact that we do not have mitigations that systems can predict and help us mitigate, rather than relying, okay, we'll figure it out when it happens.
Yeah. Proactive versus reactive is what you're talking
exactly.
about.
Yeah.
No, couldn't agree more. The being prepared, especially in those sorts of scenarios, is often the difference between a business kind of, bouncing back in a resilient way, or, like you say, collapsing under the pressure with kind of job losses and everything else that follows.
Exactly.
So Nish, a final question: how does the value chain link into skills, tech, and reshoring manufacturing?
Absolutely. So, we've all seen the rise of adoption of AI happen massively with OpenAI and Google and everybody else. Now that's brought in a front and center that in industry, there have been a lot of legacy systems and the innovation rates have been very slow. The tech is changing rapidly. Industrial adoption of it needs to be able to do the same. Imagine this. You can track when your 20-pound Amazon parcel is going to come, where it is, and when it's going to get delivered. Somebody placing an order for $1 million worth of equipment doesn't really know that. And you would imagine that, if the tech is already there, it should already be implemented. So we're seeing tech create a lot of enablement, including, being able to predict and help you navigate some of these global world events happening. So adoption of tech will be a critical element for businesses looking to maintain a resilient value chain for them and look at, making it sustainable and net zero as well. From a skill perspective, the skills required to maintain, run your value chains and identify the weak points is not, something that you just get straight out of university. That's something that people have spent years trying to get that knowledge and expertise in the different industries and understanding that. So normally these are people who have been with your companies for 10, 15 years or more. The problem is that there's a backlog happening now, that there's a gap effectively, that there isn't enough new people coming in who can actually fill those positions. And again, it's important for people to be able to reskill in those areas and assistive systems to be in place to be able to help them do that as well. Because, as we discussed earlier, if you are not in control of your value chain, you will start to struggle, and that will have negative impacts for the business. Now, that brings us to the point of reshoring of manufacturing. Because how the world has grown, and the industrialization that happened grew for when first industrial revolution was happening. It started in UK, right? Now we're in the fourth industrial revolution, and some say the fifth. And across those, things have changed. The fact that where companies, industries, countries were looking at more manufacturing-based economies, which a lot of countries still do and prosper with, that got offshored for cheap labor and production into countries like China, like India, and more. And now what we're starting to see is, with the dependencies on the world events happening, with the dependency of and ambitions towards being net zero as well, companies and countries are starting to look at investing and creating the infrastructures, and are focusing more on what do they need to reshore and how do they reshore manufacturing back into their respective countries. And it's not a one country issue. It's, every country is starting to look at that, because yes, it might be slightly costly if you look at a pure cost perspective, but then you look at the carbon footprint of that, the emissions that created, and the sustainability angle of that, the risk that you might have. And you start to see that actually, you can manage with that cost. And that cost is not a singular element, but total cost of ownership that comes into play. So reshoring of manufacturing and maintaining of your value chain through reshored networks, I see as becoming critical for specific industries, specific foundation industries. But as a good example right now, you would see this push by every country to be manufacturing semiconductors.
Semiconductors, yeah. That was the
exactly.
Came to mind when you said that.
Every country is starting to bring semiconductor in manufacturing into their own, because they see the power and the gap that sits in there, right? And that's just the start. I mean, and the similar examples are for so many different types of core foundation industries and others. And that's where, identifying where your value chain lies, where the optimization lies, where the opportunity lies, is going to be key. And for all of that, you need to understand, maintain, and build and grow your value chain together, and create it in a sustainable and ethical way also.
Yeah, fantastic. Cool. Thanks, Nish. Anything else you wanted to add about the series before we wrap up?
No, so I think it's been a great exercise to be able to do this with, the guests that have been on our podcast. And again, Adam, thanks for coming on board and interviewing me to be able to share what the vision of this season 1 of this podcast has been. And hopefully, the listeners benefit from this, and this, just spark some ideas to, think about, discuss, collaborate on. And if anybody's interested to speak more, then again, follow, subscribe, or, just drop me a DM on LinkedIn.
Great. Okay. We'll wrap it up there then. Thanks ever so much.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed this episode and found our discussion intriguing and exciting. If you want to connect with me or any of our guests, you can see our content and connect details in the summary of this episode. This podcast is sponsored by Valuechain. Valuechain is a leading B2B SaaS platform for intelligent collaboration, performance management, net zero supply chain identification, risk and resilience building, and a platform to help you manage your local and global supply chains.